1985. A tavern renovation on Blair Street in Edinburgh's Old Town. A former professional rugby player named Norrie Rowan, working on the building, breaks through what looks like an ordinary interior wall, expecting maybe another storage room on the other side. What he actually finds is a doorway into darkness that hasn't been disturbed in well over 100 years. Stone chambers, one after another, soot-blackened ceilings from long-dead forges, rusted meat hooks still bolted where they'd been left, and beneath his feet undisturbed rubble mixed with debris nobody had touched since sometime in the 1870s. No one had been inside since the century before his own had properly begun, and for a moment, by every account he later gave, he genuinely wasn't sure what he was looking at. The air itself, by every account of that first entry, had the particular stillness of a space that has genuinely not exchanged breath with the outside world in longer than any living person could remember, a kind of silence that isn't simply the absence of sound, so much as the absence of any recent disturbance at all. That discovery is the moment most retellings of this story start with, because it's the most cinematic. I want to start somewhere else, with the contract that built the space Norrie Rowan walked into, because the paperwork tells a much stranger and much more human story than the ghost tour version ever does. Here's what we're told, and it's the version that dominates almost every piece of content made about this place. The South Bridge vaults are presented, overwhelmingly, as a haunted attraction first, and a historical site a distant second, all named ghosts, sinister spectral figures, and a persistent, deeply embedded claim that the notorious killers Burke and Hare used these very chambers to stash bodies before selling them to anatomists. It's an effective pitch for a ghost tour. It's also, when you actually check it against the documented record, built on almost nothing verifiable at all. I want to give this place the treatment its actual paper trail deserves, because what really happened here, once you strip away the invented ghosts, turns out to be more forensically interesting and considerably more emotionally honest than any haunting a tour script could dream up. Let's establish the construction record first. Edinburgh's South Bridge opened in March of 1788, designed by architect Robert Kay and built under master mason Alexander Laing, a 19-arch structure spanning more than 1,000 feet, engineered to connect the crowded high street of the Old Town to the University District and the newer developments to the south. From street level, walking across it, the bridge doesn't even read as a bridge at all. Shops and buildings line both sides of the roadway the entire span, disguising the fact that you're crossing a deep valley on a structure of stone arches rather than simply walking down an ordinary city street, a design choice that made the crossing feel seamless to pedestrians, while quietly creating an enormous amount of usable space in the arches below that most people crossing overhead would never think to wonder about. Rather than leaving those 19-stone arches exposed underneath, the way a conventional bridge typically would, the builders walled them in, creating enclosed chambers beneath 18 of the arches, roughly 120 individual vaulted rooms in total, all intended from the outset as usable commercial space, storage and workshops for the merchants and tradespeople whose businesses lined the bustling street directly overhead. It was a genuinely clever piece of urban space planning for a crowded medieval city with almost nowhere left to expand outward. Edinburgh's Old Town, by the late 18th century, was already a famously vertical, tightly packed settlement, tall stone tenements called lands stacked story upon story along a narrow ridge of high ground, with almost no room left at ground level for the city to grow outward in any direction. A bridge that also generated 120 new enclosed rooms as a byproduct of its own construction was not a minor architectural bonus. It was a genuine solution to a real estate crisis the city had been struggling with for generations: build up, then use the empty space underneath rather than wasting it. If a story that starts with the actual construction contract instead of a ghost ends up more unsettling than the ghost tour ever managed, subscribe to the Historia archive right now, because that's exactly the kind of forensic reframing this channel keeps chasing. Here's the first anomaly, and it's an engineering failure, not a supernatural one. The bridge's construction, like a lot of ambitious 18th century civic projects built under political and financial pressure to finish quickly, was rushed, and the surface above the vaults was never properly sealed against water. Much of the stone used was a porous sandstone, exactly the wrong material to leave unsealed above a network of enclosed rooms. People were expected to store dry goods and conduct business inside. Almost from the moment the vaults opened for commercial use, water began seeping steadily down through the stone above, and it never stopped. The chambers grew persistently damp. Ventilation, given that these were sealed rooms carved into solid stone with limited access to open air, was poor from the start and only got worse as usage patterns changed. Cobblers, taverns, and storage tenants who had signed on expecting functional workshop space instead found themselves fighting a losing battle against constant moisture damaging their goods and their tools. Documentary evidence shows legitimate commercial tenants beginning to abandon the vaults as early as 1795, only 7 years after the bridge opened, and within roughly 3 decades of construction, the vast majority of the original intended commercial use had collapsed entirely. This wasn't a slow, graceful decline. It was a structural design flaw, making an entire underground commercial district functionally uninhabitable for the purpose it was built for, in less time than a single generation. It's worth picturing what a single one of these vaults actually looked like day to day, because the popular image, shaped almost entirely by decades of ghost tour marketing, is of a cavernous, Gothic dungeon, and that doesn't match the physical reality very well at all. Most individual chambers were modest, roughly the size of a small workshop room, arched stone ceilings low enough to press down on a tall tenant, a single entrance, and, critically, no windows at all, since the vaults sat entirely enclosed within the bridge's stone structure with no exterior wall to cut an opening through. Light came only from whatever a tenant brought in themselves. Candles or oil lamps burned inside an already poorly ventilated stone room, which tells you something about the air quality. Anyone spending real time down there was contending with even before the water problems started. A cobbler renting one of these spaces in the 1790s wasn't imagining a picturesque cellar. He was imagining, reasonably enough given the rent, a windowless stone box, just large enough for a workbench and stock, connected to a busy commercial street directly overhead by nothing more than a single flight of stairs. What happened next is the part of this story that deserves far more weight than it usually gets, because it isn't a ghost story at all, it's a poverty story. As Edinburgh's old town grew more crowded through the early 19th century, and as the nearby Cowgate district hardened into one of the city's most severe slumsum, driven by the pressures of the early Industrial Revolution, pulling more and more people into a city that had nowhere left to comfortably put them, the empty, Abandoned vaults beneath South Bridge became an unofficial answer to a housing crisis nobody was formally solving. Edinburgh's poorest residents, people with no other viable shelter, moved into spaces that legitimate businesses had already given up on as unfit for storing goods, let alone housing families. Windowless, damp, poorly ventilated stone rooms that had defeated shopkeepers within a handful of years became home to some of the city's most desperate residents, who had considerably less choice in the matter than a cobbler simply relocating his workshop somewhere drier. Understanding just how severe Old Town overcrowding had become by this point helps explain why anyone would choose a windowless, damp vault over almost any alternative. Edinburgh's tenement lands along the High Street were already recording population densities that shocked contemporary observers, entire families sharing single rooms, multiple families sometimes sharing a single stair landing, sanitation infrastructure that lagged badly behind the sheer number of people the Old Town was being asked to hold. Against that backdrop, a vault beneath South Bridge, however damp, however dark, offered something increasingly scarce in the neighborhood, a defined, enclosed space nobody else was actively competing for. Because the businesses that had tried it first had already given up and left. For a family with no better option, that made the vaults, paradoxically, one of the more available forms of shelter in a city that had run out of almost everywhere else to put its poorest residents. If a building that failed as a commercial space and then quietly became emergency housing for people, the rest of the city had no other plan. For is the kind of overlooked social history you want more of? Go ahead and subscribe now, because that's precisely the story this investigation is built to tell, instead of the one everyone already expects. I want to be direct about separating documented history from tourist legend here, because the two have become so tangled together in popular retellings that most visitors leave unable to tell which parts actually happened. It is true, and well documented, that the vaults during this period hosted illegal activity alongside desperate housing, unlicensed taverns operating outside city regulation, illicit whiskey distilling happening in spaces nobody was formally inspecting, the kind of underground economy that naturally forms in any space poor enough and unsupervised enough to attract it. What is not documented, despite how central it's become to the modern tourist pitch, is any verified connection between the vaults and the killers William Burke and William Hare, who murdered at least 16 people in Edinburgh between 1827 and 1828, not through grave robbing as popular legend often simplifies it, but by luring vulnerable, often destitute victims to their deaths and smothering them to avoid visible wounds before selling the bodies to anatomy schools. Burke and Hare's crimes are real, exhaustively documented, and genuinely horrifying on their own terms. Their specific use of the South Bridge vaults as a body storage site is not supported by the same kind of verifiable record, and appears to be a later addition grafted onto the vaults' story because it's a compelling detail that happens to fit the neighborhood and the era. The named ghosts that populate modern tour scripts, a spectral child, a supposedly malevolent figure, follow the same pattern, atmospheric additions built for the tour experience rather than claims resting on any documented sighting or record from the period the vaults were actually in active use. None of that means the real history here is boring by comparison. It's the opposite. Real people, driven from every better housing option available to them, lived out entire portions of their lives in rooms that professional tradesmen had already rejected as unfit for storing merchandise, That's not a footnote to a ghost story. That's the actual, harder, more important story the space has to tell, and it gets buried every time a tour script reaches for an invented haunting instead. It's worth asking, honestly, why the ghost story version won out so completely over the documented poverty history. Because the answer says something uncomfortable about how difficult, unglamorous history tends to get packaged for public consumption. A story about Burke and Hare stashing bodies is tidy, self-contained, and comes with a built-in villain audiences already recognized from a dozen other retellings of Edinburgh's grave-robbing era. A story about families surviving in windowless, damp stone rooms because the city had genuinely run out of anywhere better to put them, requires the audience to sit with something considerably less comfortable: structural poverty, civic failure, and the fact that the people who actually lived in these vaults left behind almost no names, no diaries, nothing beyond broken plates and a child's toy for anyone to remember them by. Ghosts are easier to sell tickets around than an unnamed family's medicine bottle. That doesn't make the ghost story true. It just makes it more marketable, and marketability, over enough decades of tourism-driven retelling, has a way of quietly displacing the version of events that actually happened. By around 1875, roughly a century after the bridge first opened, city authorities moved to close off the vaults from continued occupation entirely, concerned about the unregulated activity and the genuinely dangerous, unsanitary conditions the spaces had deteriorated into. Workers packed many of the chambers with rubble, sealing entrances, and effectively erasing public access and public memory of the vaults at the same time. This wasn't unique to South Bridge. Edinburgh's Victorian authorities were, in this same era, engaged in a broader campaign of old town slum clearance, driven by a genuine, well-documented public health movement responding to overcrowding, disease, and sanitation failures across the district. And the vaults simply represented one especially severe, especially concealable example of exactly the housing conditions that movement was trying to eliminate. Sealing them wasn't framed at the time as erasing history. It was framed as closing down one of the worst housing conditions in the entire city, which, judging by what excavators would eventually find inside, was not an unreasonable assessment. For the next 110 years, this entire network sat exactly as it had been left, forgotten beneath a city that kept building and rebuilding directly overhead, without any working knowledge of what remained sealed underneath its own streets. If the idea of an entire underground district getting deliberately packed with rubble and forgotten for over a century, hiding directly beneath a city that kept living its normal life on top of it, is the kind of forensic time capsule you want more of, subscribe to the Historia Archive, because finding exactly these gaps between what got sealed away and what got remembered is the entire premise of this channel. Which brings us back to 1985, and to what Norrie Rowan actually found once the initial shock of the discovery wore off and archaeologists were finally able to properly examine the space. This wasn't an empty ruin. It was, in the most literal sense available to archaeology, a sealed midden of real ordinary human habitation, undisturbed since the 1870s closure. Excavators recovered children's toys, small enough and specific enough to make clear that families, not just single desperate adults, had been living in these chambers, medicine bottles, the physical record of illness treated, or more often, not adequately treated, in conditions that offered no real path to recovery. Plates, cups, and other domestic fragments, the ordinary detritus of people trying to maintain some version of normal daily life inside rooms that had already failed as commercial space decades before they ever moved in. The physical layering of what excavators found tells its own story about how gradually the vault's function shifted over their working life. Deeper strata, closer to the original stone floor, tended to hold the debris of the earlier commercial period, discarded tools, scraps consistent with cobbling and small-scale trade. Higher layers, closer to the point of final sealing, held the domestic material, the toys, the bottles, the broken tableware, evidence that the same physical rooms had quietly transitioned from workshop to home over a span of decades, without any single dramatic event marking the change. Nobody decided on a specific day that this vault would now be a residence instead of a shop. It simply happened, tenant by tenant, need by need, until the accumulated evidence in the ground told the story more clearly than any single surviving document could. None of it was staged. None of it was curated for a modern audience. It was simply what got left behind when the doors were sealed, and nobody came back, a genuine, dated, physically verifiable record of who had actually been living in Edinburgh's forgotten underground in the years before the Victorian authorities decided to wall it off for good. That's the actual answer to why this place is worth investigating at all, and it has nothing to do with ghosts. The South Bridge vaults are not remarkable because something supernatural allegedly happened inside them. They're remarkable because they represent a rare, physically preserved record of exactly how a city's most vulnerable residents actually lived when every better option had already closed to them. Sealed by accident of Victorian public health policy and rediscovered by accident of a 1985 tavern renovation, telling a far more honest story about urban poverty than any invented haunting ever could. Robert Kay's construction contract created the space. A porous sandstone design flaw emptied it of the businesses it was built for within a single generation. And the people the rest of the city had nowhere else to put filled that emptiness until the day the doors were bricked shut and the whole thing simply disappeared from public memory for 110 years. There's a kind of irony sitting at the center of this whole timeline that's worth spelling out plainly. A structure built to solve one problem, Edinburgh's desperate shortage of usable space, ended up creating a second, entirely unplanned problem, a network of damp, hazardous rooms nobody could safely occupy for their intended purpose. That second problem then became, almost by accident, the closest thing some of the city's poorest residents had to an available solution to their own housing crisis. And when the city government finally moved to close the vaults off in the 1870s, they weren't demolishing a curiosity or erasing a landmark. They were, in the language of the era, addressing a public health hazard, sealing away exactly the population whose presence there had been created by a chain of civic failures stretching back nearly a century, back to a construction contract that never accounted for what would happen when Edinburgh's sandstone met a century of Scottish rain. Thank you for watching. Next time someone tells you the South Bridge vaults are haunted, ask them whether they've heard about the medicine bottles instead, because I think that detail says a lot more about what actually happened down there than any ghost story does. Some of the vaults are open to the public today, guided tours walking visitors through chambers that once held workshops and later entire families, and it's worth going in knowing which parts of what you'll hear are documented and which parts were added later to make the walk more dramatic. Let me know in the comments What you think happened to the families who lived in these vaults after the doors were finally sealed in 1875, whether they found somewhere better, or whether the city simply pushed its housing crisis somewhere else it hadn't gotten around to sealing yet. I'll see you in the next investigation.